First of all, I'd like to thank the Work Comp Central, and I would like to thank Yvonne, you, and everybody else for inviting us to be here. I think it's an honor to be part of the comp log process. My particular appreciation of this organization is that this process is that it focuses really on the injured workers and what can be done for them. And there's a lot to be said about that. Today we have Alex Swedlow, who has 25 years of experience in health services research, public policy, analysis, and data development. He's published numerous research studies. In 2013, he was named president of the Workers' Compensation Institute. He had joined it in 1988 as an independent consultant. And he has a master's in strategic planning, health services research from George Washington University. John Ruser holds a PhD and an MA degree in economics from the University of Chicago, a BA in economics from Princeton, president and CEO of the WCRI. And he's published his CompScope. He took over from Rick Victor, has written many books and articles on occupational safety, health, workers' compensation, and employee benefits. Jennifer Wolf has been with the IAIBC since 2002 and 2012. She was elected as the executive director. One of the things I'd like to put a shout out for is she's done some podcasts. There's a COVID-19 Catch-22 podcast you can find on YouTube. You should go and see that. She has a special interest in disability management and the use of technology in regulation administration. She's written or helped write the IAIBC Disaster Preparedness Guide, and we're in the middle of the COVID-19, so I think that's a really handy guide. She's written numerous articles on resources, jurisdictional benchmarking, and medical treatment guidelines. For me, it is a privilege to be on the virtual diocese with these three. And I need to say this because I think not many people realize, but in my opinion, these three have done more to save lives and prevent disability than any other three people in the workers' compensation system. If you go back to the early identification of the opioid epidemic and the involvement of these three in educating the industry on the dangers, one of my favorite vignettes of that was Alex Swedlow talking about children who were under 18 years of age being given opioid pills, which were extraordinarily inappropriate. And this effort, in my opinion, saved more lives than almost anything else in the workers' compensation system. So it's a really, really great privilege to be on the virtual diocese with these. What we're going to do is we'll start with Alex, who's going to focus primarily on the state of California. He has an amazing resource and an amazing system for analytics on the COVID-19. Then, as we're going through, Jennifer will do some spot education on the national presumptions and things like that. John's going to expand the focus even further to the United States. And then we'll be able to take some questions and sign off. But so Alex, oh yeah, one other thing. I want to thank Chase for doing our slide movement for you. Thank you very much, Chase, for doing that. Appreciate it. Alex, you're up.
Great. Thank you, Bill. And just for a little balance, you've always been a terrific colleague in our time together in workers' compensation. And it's a special delight for me to be back at Comp Laude. It was only just a few years ago, and it was a bittersweet thing that I received what would become the last summa cum laude award provided by David DiPaolo, who was just a wonderful colleague and terrific force in our industry. And all the good work provided by WorkComp Central and the Comp Laude Awards. It's just a pleasure to be back, even more so with John and Jennifer. So let's move into our presentation. This is going to be all about, I guess, a general discussion on. We'll begin with what kind of data is really required to get our hands around the color and character of COVID and where we're going. We have spent quite a bit of our available resources and focus once COVID really hit California in March, developing and implementing a COVID-19 related research study. And that dealt very much so with developing new data and survey data and combining all these things without a roadmap. And we were not alone. John and Jennifer and others in our research world were all kind of trying to find our way. So we're going to provide some of our current thinking on what we've found since March. Anything to add, Jennifer or John?
Ladies first. Jennifer, you're muted.
Jennifer?
Yeah, thanks so much, John. You know, I think when we talked in our planning call about the different data sources and how data is being used, from the IIBC's perspective, our community really represents the state workers' compensation agencies. And when we talked about data and missing data, the thing that really came to my mind was not so much about missing data, but missing people. And really, there are only a handful of states that have data analysts and researchers on staff. And those states that do, as we'll talk a little bit about, are using those resources and the data to provide meaningful insights. And I think that that really is a missed opportunity from the state regulatory perspective. I think, as Alex is going to demonstrate and John is going to show, data can be used in real time to provide meaningful information and provide the industry a pathway in how to respond. And so for me, in terms of data and the use of that data, COVID gives us so many lessons. And as an industry, having research analysts and data analysts is such a valuable investment. So.
Right.
Yeah,
Well
Jennifer, that is very well said. I just wanted to note that during this presentation, we're going to show some of very early data on COVID based on the data that's provided by our data providers. We're very fortunate to get data feeds from carriers, from TPAs, from data covering the residual market. So we'll have a fairly complete picture, but a very early picture of COVID. And so in terms of what's missing, well, what's missing is the future right now. We will continue to follow the data and get a more complete picture of the impact of COVID and the shutdown and ultimate recovery. But a lot of our data are fairly immature at this point in time.
Yeah, and we had talked earlier about the enormous pressure we three were feeling in the early days, the early stages of COVID back in March and April to tell our state legislators and regulators exactly what COVID was going to cost and exactly how many claims were going to be in our system. And that was a tall order, but we are getting better at it. And we'll be taking the audience through our current state understanding. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to begin with our current review of COVID-19 in the California workers' compensation system. The next slide will kind of lay out how we went about building our initial databases. Back in March and April, when the pressure was mounting to size and describe what would become the full effect of COVID-19, we were all scrambling for those building blocks and infection rates, symptomatic rates, hospital use, mortality, cost per claim. And the data these indices were just not really available, and the ones that were available were very unstable and almost unreliable. We were reaching out to places like Iceland and Wuhan and Canada, as well as the United States. And it was that use of those early indices that were changing on almost an hourly basis that produced some extremely wide variation in terms of all those original estimates of how many would become infected, how many would be medical-only claims, how many would be permanent disability claims, and how many would succumb to the infection. None of which was particularly satisfying, at least for us, but it did give us an appreciation for the need to continue to develop the data, as well as have a little patience. The next slide, please. Began with our expanding research agenda on COVID. We realized that not only was there a thirst for characteristics of COVID, but also trying to measure our system's readiness to deal with COVID claims in the workers' comp system. So we put special studies, special surveys out in the field to measure the readiness of telemedicine, which was really going to become vital in this area. We conducted webinars on specific pieces of legislation and regulation that formed the rules of the road, so to speak, in how we will admit, evaluate, and treat and deliver benefits to COVID-injured workers. We published a white paper on the history of presumptions because in those early stages there was a rather intense debate over not will we have a presumption, but what flavor of presumption will we have? Will it be conclusive? Will it be rebuttable? And we in California have a fairly long history of dealing with such presumptions. It also allowed us to put another survey into the field about just how were early adjudication decisions being made? How were the adjusters dealing with COVID claims even in advance of legislation or governor's executive orders? And then finally, it culminated most recently in an ongoing online application, which everyone is invited to use. We'll get to some of the results of this, but let's go to the next slide. It began with looking at the history of COVID-19, its influence in workers' compensation, and the history of presumptions in California. I had mentioned that we have decades worth of experience in dealing with presumptions, but it also included some early indications of how claims were being reviewed, investigated, accepted, or denied. But the debate within California on the presumptions was rather robust, rather protracted, and we got lots of phone calls from other states asking about how the debate was going, what were the bumper rails on the presumptions. And we just thought, if someone somewhere could put together a map of all the presumption activity that was occurring, it would really help ground the discussion, not just for California, but in other jurisdictions. And lo and behold, someone came to our rescue.
Thanks so much, Alex. I think that's one of the things that in those early months of the pandemic, state legislatures and regulatory agencies were really trying to get their handle on how workers' compensation was going to handle these cases. They were starting to get cases filed, and there was, across the U.S. Pushes either from an executive order perspective or, emergency legislation that would address the presumption issue. So this map shows you the presumptions that are in place across the United States right now. There are about 15 states that have presumptions. Some of you will note, and I probably should have included a different color here, Wisconsin had a presumption for about 4 weeks. Then it was struck down through a court decision. But the presumptions, seeing this map, it's really important, like almost everything in workers' compensation, that not every presumption is created equal. Some presumptions, like in California, are quite expansive and cover, most of them address healthcare workers, first responders. Some of them are extended to frontline workers, which are defined, in the legislation or the executive order. Some of them, for example, Pennsylvania, are extraordinarily narrow. In Pennsylvania, the presumption includes benefits only for state National Guard members. So in Utah, it's only for first responders. So it will be interesting because of the unique nature of coronavirus to see how that presumption, whether or not that there's a presumption in the state, how that impacts or influences how these cases are handled. And I think the data, going back to what we're talking about, the data is really going to be important to try to use to understand and answer questions about the need and the impact of those presumption activities. But I think, sort of turning it back over to Alex, they really were really the earliest leaders on using the data to help us understand what was going on in California. So we'll turn it back over to the next slide with Alex.
Thank you, Jennifer. One of the earliest moments of contention back in April and May were assertions of how claims were being adjudicated in the absence of legislation or our governor's implementation of a series of executive orders. There were a lot of anecdotal assertions out there, high denial rates, delays, in investigation, and it was really just crying out for some grounded, objective data. So we put a survey out into the field, 28 organizations, which gave us information on, at the time, more than 50% of all the reported COVID claims in March and April. It was a good representation of insurers and self-insureds, and it confirmed a couple of important points. It confirmed that COVID claims were largely entering our workers' comp system via the healthcare, first responder, and critical infrastructure industries, and that those claims were coming into our system via the normal channels, certain specific forms that were common to different stakeholders, but there was nothing unusual about the way the claims were entering our system. What became really important were on the next slide were the following two questions on our survey. We have a quick poll. To the attendees of this session, are you handling COVID related claims? Please select all that apply. Okay, let's go to the next slide. It was the following two questions that really helped provide some objective data points in a growing, very contentious debate. What we found in that early sample was that about 28% of the claims that had been reported were accepted, but almost 37% were still under investigation. And this was due in large measure to the lack of availability of COVID tests or the delayed amount of time needed to get a response and a result of the COVID test. But what we did find and was confirmed was a 35.5% denial rate, significantly higher than non-COVID claims, almost by a factor of 2.5 to 3 times higher. And this was the question that was really calling out for the following question, which is, why are these claims being denied? And what we found couldn't have made more sense and couldn't have been more aligned with what would become the governor's executive order, as well as the presumption legislation. 70% of those denials were because of a negative COVID test. The balance was due to the contracting the exposure, the virus outside of the workplace, not having a doctor's diagnosis, or flat out refusal to take a COVID test, all of which made perfect sense to us and really aligned with the theory and intent of what would become the governor's orders, and as well as the legislature. Next slide. Things began to change for us when we partnered with our Division of Workers' Compensation to have access to what would be the most timely data in the state for COVID and non-COVID related claims. We started receiving downloads on a twice every other week basis, and it allowed us, oh, and by the way, this is an application that is on our website, cwci.org. Everyone is invited to log on. You don't need to be a member. It's in the public domain. And you will find in that COVID app 5 specific tabs of information, specific color and characteristics of COVID-19 claims, comparisons of COVID and non-COVID claims from 2019 and 2020, some trends, industry detail, and notification and denial background. And all of these different tabs, as you will see when you log on, can be customized and can be altered and filtered by a variety of different dimensions, including industry and region, demographics of age and location, industry description, whether you're just interested in the self-insured or insured market, and other areas of concern. Let's just very quickly step through some key findings that were made available to us just yesterday. We actually got some new data in, and we'll have some results for you on the next slide. The first tab gives us some basic high-level information, tote boat of sorts, on COVID claims, as well as the characteristics of those COVID claims. And at the top of the application, we'll see that we are sitting at right now at about 50,592 reported COVID claims through the close of October, and that it's the healthcare sectors and public safety officers and manufacturing that make up the top 3 industries. And off to the right, you can see the bell curve-like distribution of COVID claims, both reported and what we are describing as projected. COVID claims do, in fact, enter our system much slower than non-COVID claims, but you can see that we hit the top of the curve in July with a projected total of about just under 16,000, and it's been falling ever since. In October, we're projecting perhaps a bit of a small uptick. We don't know whether or not things are going to really begin to escalate again with the resurgence of the virus, but it's clear that this data showed that we very quickly ramped up and then began to react to the adjudication process. Let's go to the next tab. And this was a comparison of 2019, I'm sorry for the typo, versus 220 claim volume, both COVID and non-COVID. In addition to COVID-related claims, there was a lot of commentary about the fall off in regular workers' compensation claims because of the mass layoffs and rising unemployment. Regular reported claims began to disappear from our system. So this is just a piece of that second application tab that shows, on average, since January, we're finding about 22% fewer claims in our system than at the same point in time last year. However, if we adjust for the late reporting factors, especially in the COVID population, we're now projecting about 12.5% fewer claims through October. And this is something that we will continue to look at. Next slide. The third tab allows us to look at certain trends, comparative trends on the timing of how claims are entering the system, the ability to separate out COVID and non-COVID claims, insured versus self-insured, and denials. We've already talked about the fall off in general claim frequency. If we look at just 2020, that center bar, what we find is that the percentage of COVID claims has also gone through a bit of a bell curve, hitting the top of it in July of about 25% of all reported claims were COVID, and then more or less a steady decrease. Now, those last 2 data points of September and October of 8.4 and 7.3, I would characterize as very soft. We will be experiencing a higher level of new reported claims for those months, but overall, about 11% of our claims in 2020 are COVID related. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of industry details, it's this fourth tab that allows you to select one of about 20 different industries, and in doing so, you're able to pull up a lot of detail on that particular industry sector. Here's two examples. Off to the left is the region breakdown comparing COVID versus non-COVID claims in that region for 2020. And as you can see on that top line, like so many of our issues in California, everything begins in Los Angeles. But Los Angeles, while being associated with about 1 in 4 claims in our state, actually has about 1 in 3 of all of our COVID claims. So there's a real higher representation of COVID in that particular region. And if you were further interested in the class codes underneath that particular industry sector, the application provides all the associated class codes with many of the associated measures and indices that we've already talked about. Let's go to the next slide and the fifth and final tab, notification and denials. Here's just two screenshots from the application. And again, what this shows at the top are the percentage of denied claims. Recall in that earlier study that we made in early May that we were looking at about a 35% denial rate. That has since come down a little bit in the months of June, July, and August. The September and October values of 22 and 13% are obviously understating what will eventually be the full denial rate, but we are still looking approximately at about a 29 to 30% denial rate for COVID claims, roughly 2.5 times that of non-COVID claims in our state. And below is a description of just one of the challenges in estimating the claim counts, as well as all the other dimensions. And it's just simply the fact that every way we look at the handoffs in our system, whether it's the date of injury to the employer's notification, or the employer to the claims adjuster, or the date of injury to the claim adjuster, you can see on that third line in each of the three sectors and just compare for any given month the simple realization that COVID claims just take a lot longer to enter our system than non-COVID claims. And that presents some of the great challenges to early adjudication decisions and also getting the right benefits and medical care to injured workers. Move to the last.
Alex,
yes.
One comment I'd like to make, and that is that the governor's presumption is based on a positive COVID test, right?
That's right, or a doctor's diagnosis.
Okay, and so that's, you already mentioned, but I think it bears repeating again in terms of, we believe that one of the largest continued reasons for denials is the fact that the tests are not coming out positive.
Well, and if you think about it, that's just, it makes sense. We're all struggling with trying to read in symptoms, and I know I'm guilty of this. There were times where I thought I had COVID because I coughed a few times, and it turns out to be not the case. And the distance between that initial suspicion and the confirmation can be days. Earlier in the COVID pandemic, it was weeks. Let's go to the last slide. Now, I had mentioned in the early months of COVID-related research, there weren't a lot of indices available to help us estimate the number of claims. But one of the more popular ones for research groups like ourselves and several others were the use of proxies. Proxies like, let's just use the working age population as an estimate of workers' comp claims, or let's use similar claims from history 5-10 years ago that shared certain characteristics like respiratory distress or pneumonia. None of those really served us well, and this graphic really shows just one of the reasons why many of us were so off the mark. This is a graph that shows for the state of California all infected working-aged Californians between 18 and 65 in light blue for both cases as well as deaths, and in dark blue the count of workers' comp claims. And at the end of the day, through the month of September, only 7.2% of the infected working-aged Californians filed a workers' comp claim, and only 4% of the fatalities of working-aged Californians had a related workers' compensation claim. So it was clear that the vast majority were being exposed by these by the virus outside of the workplace.
So I thank you so much, Alex, for walking us through the app and showing us all of the different functionality. As we said in the planning call, when I first saw the CWCI app, I got really jealous. Certainly, the way that it demonstrates data and shares in real time, or pretty much real time, what's happening in the state of California is a great achievement, and I thank you for putting it out there. And I think that it's a perfect example, and hopefully more organizations and states will use it and build something similar. I will sort of mention that besides California, there are a handful of states that are also using the data to inform and to share information with the public on what is going on related to COVID cases in their workers' compensation systems. And because we needed another map in our lives this week, I have a few more to share. And so the green states are states that are using data and publishing information on their COVID workers' compensation cases. I have all of the links that I'd be willing to share. They're all publicly available as well, but wanted to give you a couple of highlights. I think Florida is a state that has done a really good job. They are publishing a monthly report on COVID cases, and as of October of 2020, they are recording about 21,000 COVID indemnity claims in their state, and they have reported in the most recent report that the total benefits paid for all of those cases was about 30 million. That's contrasted with a state like Minnesota. Minnesota, in their most recent report, they have had 6,000 COVID claims. And all of these states are looking at the industries that are particularly impacted, and they align very much with what you're seeing in California, which is the vast majority, 50% or more, 50, 60, 70% are healthcare workers, and followed by first responders and safety workers. Another state, Texas, they've done a data call, and we're anticipating that their initial research, they've included some medical benefit information in that data call. So we anticipate that they will be releasing something in the next couple of months on COVID cases in Texas. So one of the things that the IIBC has been doing since the start of the pandemic is getting together with the state regulators for regulators to share information and talk through how they're responding. And during those calls, it was very evident that people wanted to understand how many COVID workers' compensation cases that were happening in the various states. And so the IIBC stepped into that, and we recognized that we could serve as a facilitator and aggregate some of that very raw data. And so so we've been doing that for a couple of months now, and we've been collecting information. Right now, we've got about 25 states who've been sharing their case counts. And this information is for most of the states, is through the month of October. And the map shows the percentage of COVID claims from the total claim population through October. And those states in the lighter colors have a smaller percentage, so 10% or less. And those states that are darker, Florida and Michigan, for example, have a higher percentage of their cases. So about 30% of their total claims are COVID claims. Now, I want to make sure that to caveat this map and caveat that information, it's not necessarily comparable across jurisdictions in the way we would like it to be, because states, as we know, have different reporting requirements. So for example, Florida and Minnesota, these are only lost time or indemnity claims. Other of the states are including all of the cases. But it is the first kind of national picture, I think, of how many cases we're seeing. So through October, there were about 131,000 COVID work comp cases in the 25 states that we have been aggregating information for. And then, as Alex mentioned, one of the other areas that states and the industry is really interested in is the percentage of denials. And so we have, and apologies because there is a typo on this slide as well, this should be the percentage of denied COVID claims and across the states. And there's, again, it ranges. There's a wide variation across the states in the percentage of denied work comp COVID claims. Some of the states have very low denials, Washington and New York, for example. Washington, I think one of the reasons that their denial rate is so low is because they made a policy choice that they were just going to pay exposure claims for the quarantine period. So, and so I think those policy decisions are influencing some of the behaviors that we're seeing across jurisdictions. Many of the states, the median is about 33%, which aligns, I think, very closely with what Alex is seeing, and Alex's data is much more robust and higher quality than the data that we're getting, but the median denial rate is right in that 30% range. And then we have the outlier, which is Colorado, and their denial rate was 67%. So that's a really interesting sort of outlier, and not exactly sure what is driving that. And for just want to also note that I always find it interesting to look at, are there differences in the states that have presumptions and the states that don't? All of the states that have a star are the states that have a presumption of some kind. And I can't find any clear link between the denial rate and the presumption. But it's something, again, that I think we will see unfold over the next, as this data matures and this claim set matures. And then finally, I think now we're going to talk about the cost of COVID claims. This is something that I know everyone is eager to understand. What is going to be the medical and the wage replacement benefits for these type of cases? And you know, we talked about this as a panel, and I think it's a very challenging question to answer right now. From the state reported information, the vast majority of these cases are pretty low cost from a medical perspective. Some of them, you know, don't require really any medical treatment, and it's just the lost wages from that isolation or quarantine period. However, we do know a small percentage of these cases do, require hospitalizations and more intensive care. But we are gonna, it's definitely something that is gonna continue to mature, what those long-term medical costs are gonna be, and especially for those cases where there was long-term hospitalization, because my understanding is that oftentimes these cases require rehab, and you know, it's a longer, these are longer cases to develop. Alex, John, did you guys want to comment on the cost of COVID claims?
John, would you like to begin?
I would just observe what I sort of observed at the beginning, which is we're going to learn a lot more about the cost of these claims. As Jennifer said, many of them are short duration, low cost claims, but there will be some fraction of long-term claims, the so-called long haul cases of COVID, and that is still to be determined.
I'll make a sort of a general comment, and that is in my level, both as a risk manager and at a insurance company or several insurance companies, a very small percentage of the claims accounted for a large percentage of our dollars. And most of the organizations I've been with, and it varies by exposure, obviously, but my rule of thumb was 3% of the claims actually accounted for about 60% of my dollars. And frankly, I'm going to be very, very surprised if we don't see a similar number eventually coming out of the COVID claims. It'll be interesting to see how that, but John is absolutely right. It always takes a while to get the numbers and really see what we're going to end up with.
In our line of work, it's a dangerous thing to have to say, I don't know, but we are beginning to realize that using analogies, using claims with similar characteristics from history, it just doesn't always pan out. This is a virus that is very slippery. It's already mutating. We simply don't know what the short and long-term ramifications of medical treatment and disability are going to be. But we will very shortly begin to be able to take baby steps in looking at characteristics of treatment. But it has not been lost on any of us that this is going to be a big area of focus. It's also going to be a huge area of focus in trying to resolve the challenges that are likely to come in distinguishing, was this a workers' comp, or was this a group health, or was this a federal program? Whose nickel is it anyway? To say nothing of perhaps downstream challenges with Medicare set-asides. We simply don't know what the long-term ramifications are going to be.
You can move to the next slide.
Here we go.
So I will take over now and talk about the effect of COVID-19 on workers' compensation claims, particularly through June of this year. So next slide, please. We're going to look at how the percentage of COVID claims compares across the states, look at how the number of work comp claims, particularly non-COVID claims, changed in the first quarters of the pandemic by state and industry. I was gratified to see in one of Alex's slides that some of the numbers that we see are quite similar to his. We'll look a little bit about the composition of injuries in industries that are impacted by COVID, and how did the share of lost time claims change over time? So next slide, please. So we're going to be looking across 28 states, and we're going to focus on paid claims. So for the actuaries and other folks who are very involved in claims data, looking at paid claims is one way of looking at the claims, but you could also throw in the claims that only have reserves, and you could even throw in those claims that didn't have any dollars associated with them yet. We're going to look at the ones that had payments associated with them, either indemnity or medical, because those are the ones that are most likely to be accepted. We don't have good data on denials and acceptances the way Jennifer and Alex have. So we're going to look both at all claims and those with more than 7 days of lost time. So next slide, please. So first of all, I want to tell you that these are very preliminary findings. And in fact, this audience is one of the first public audiences to see these data. We are planning to publish the report later in the month. I've compressed the data down into some tables and a few charts. We will have considerably more detail in the report that I hope all of you will, if you're a member, get for free, or if you're not a member, purchase from us. So let's look first at across the 28 states at the percentage of claims that are COVID claims. And so the top line of this particular chart indicates that if you look at the percentage of COVID claims among all paid claims, there's a wide range across the different states from 1% to 42%. And this is in the second quarter of 2020. So we're talking about April through June. So an incredibly wide range. The 1% is in South Carolina and Kansas, and the highest percentage is in Massachusetts. And to Jennifer's point, where she was looking at the relationship between the stars on the map and the percentage of denials, Massachusetts has the highest percentage of COVID claims. It's not a presumption state. It wasn't one then, it's not one now. And yet Massachusetts has the highest percentage of COVID claims. Massachusetts is a pay without prejudice state, and those payments are used frequently. So when we look at the percentage of COVID claims among paid claims with more than 7 days of lost time, that ranges from 5 to 59%. Again, Massachusetts is at the top with 59%. South Carolina and Kansas are down there at the other end of the spectrum. So bottom line, a very wide range in the fraction of COVID claims, reflecting, of course, the nature of the spread of the virus. It hit the Northeast sooner, and well, it also hit the West Coast, but hit the Northeast particularly hard. So a lot of the states that are at the top range, of course, are those in the Northeast, whereas some of the other states were spared, at least early on. Next slide, please. So this shows the drop in non-COVID claims in 2020 quarter two as compared to the same quarter in 2019, and it shows incredibly dramatic declines in non-COVID claims. Most of the states experienced at least a 30% decline in claims, all the way up to about 53% for New York. And the number that I'm showing for California looks a lot like the average of Alex's April through June figures. So again, this would be the drop in non-COVID claims associated with the shutdowns. I will note that if I had overlaid declines in employment from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you would see that the employment declines are much smaller than these drops in claiming. So part of the decline is the fact that folks are out of work. Part of the decline is the fact that there are folks not claiming, even though they're still employed. It could be they're working at home like I am. It could be that they are not claiming for other reasons. We don't know. Next slide, please. So we have another poll question. So with the research presented, are you surprised by the data? And you get to choose yes, or you get to choose no. I'm going to be surprised by my own slide when it finally appears back on the screen.
Exactly.
Okay, so this slide shows that when we look at the fraction of all claims that have at least 7 days of lost time, they increased in 2020 quarter two as compared to the same quarter of 2019. And there are two reasons for that. If we look at non-COVID claims, a higher fraction of non-COVID claims involved more than 7 days of lost time in 2020 as opposed to 2019. So in a typical state, the so-called median state across all of our 28 states, 22% of non-COVID claims involved more than 7 days of lost time in 2020, as opposed to 18% in 2019. And in the report, you'll see that just like every other thing and across the different states, there's a wide variety in the differentials between the 2 years. So that's one reason why there are more than 7 day lost time cases in 2020. The other reason, of course, is COVID claims. COVID claims are much more likely to have more than 7 days of lost time than our non-COVID claims. So in a typical state, 93% of the paid COVID claims that we see in a typical state had more than 7 days of lost time, as compared to 22% of paid non-COVID claims. Next slide. So Where are we seeing COVID claims? Well, these data should not be surprising to you. This slide and the next one. WCRI lumps claims into various industry and occupation groupings. So we strip out all the clerical and professional occupations out of all of the industries and put them separately. But what this shows is that two industry groups, the high-risk services group and the low-risk services group, have experienced most of the COVID claims in both Q1 and Q2 of 2020. Next slide, please. So drilling down into those two big bars, we see that it is, just again, consistent with what Jennifer and Alex have said. Most of the COVID claims that we're seeing across the different states occurred in assisted living facilities, hospitals, and to a lesser extent in the offices of physicians and dentists. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that I actually find really fascinating because I had a prior about what would happen to the distribution of claims across injury types. My hypothesis was that sprains and strains, soft tissue injuries, that for which there's a little bit more of a subjective component, might have dropped in 2020 as compared to 2019 relative to other kinds of injuries. In fact, if you look at the distributions of injuries in 2019 and 2020, they are very similar. So that while there was a big drop in the non-COVID claims in the second quarter of 2020 in particular, what's left when they're still claiming looks exactly the same in terms of injury composition. Next slide. So anyway, what I've shown you is that there's substantial variation in the percentage of paid COVID claims across the states, reflecting the surge, where the surge occurred, and also some payment patterns. There have been large decreases in paid non-COVID claims, higher share of those of more than 7 days lost claims in 2020 than in 2019. As we know, most of the COVID claims so far have been seen in hospitals, assisted living facilities, and offices of physicians and dentists. However, surprisingly, there's really no change in the injury composition of the work comp paid claims. And that's my story.
Excellent. So I have some highlights here that I'd like to go through really quickly. First of all, Jennifer pointed out the importance of states having internal resources for data analysis and data collection. And I think, Jennifer, you want to build on that a little bit in terms of the importance of almost real time? You're muted.
I'm muted again, always. And I'm in control of my own mic, so I can't blame it on anyone. No, Bill, I appreciate the opportunity. I think that, workers' compensation is a data-rich industry. We collect and gather a lot of data. The states are driven by data. Unfortunately, there's just a lot of data lags in the system. It takes a long time to get this data, and we are in an era where we can be getting this data in real time. And we know the sooner that we understand what's going on in businesses and to injured workers, the better that we can target interventions and make outcomes, improve outcomes. So I think really we should be moving toward collecting and getting data in real time and using that data to inform all aspects of our system. And I think, the IABC is trying to facilitate that from a regulatory reporting perspective with the implementation of some new EDI standards in a different format besides the flat file with our XML format, which is getting very technical. But I do think that there's this capability, and I think, Alex, the demonstration of your application and other state agencies using dashboards and collecting and displaying information to the public and to interested parties and stakeholders, it can only improve the system.
Thank you. Actually, you hit on my second highlight, and John pointed out the data that was missing was the future data and what will be needed going forward. Number 3 item I have is Alex talked a little bit about the pressure that state legislatures and administrators are putting on all the researchers to explain how much it would cost. And the initial projections were extraordinarily large in the ranges that came out of the various rating bureaus in the various states. It was astonishing. One of the projections was, I think, almost 2/3 of the entire system in the United States in one state. So it was a little, shocking to see the numbers, if you will. Another thing that I think is really important is the CWCI created a white paper on the history of presumptions. That was a little tidbit that if you're interested and you are local jurisdiction or your jurisdiction is interested in presumptions, I think that's a basic paper that should be included in what you're doing. The other comment I'd like to make that came out of this is that the IAIBC is an extraordinarily valuable resource for where the existing regulations are and information about what state or jurisdiction is working on particular ones. Jennifer, I particularly liked your comment on not every presumption is created equal. I did not know, frankly, that the state National Guard members in Pennsylvania were under presumption. That was a new one to me. Alex, you did a great job in terms of presenting the CWCI.org COVID tab availability, and I think that's a piece of the puzzle out there. You kept saying, and I'm not sure how to adequately advertise it, but I think you said it's open to the public. It's got huge information on it. It's really out there, and that's I think, quite useful. John, you did a very good job of, again, explaining, the comparisons, if you will, in terms of COVID versus non-COVID. I find that very, very interesting in terms of what's going on. And then I think everybody also touched on the issues of why there might be a different denial rate. So that was very, very useful. I'm not sure. I've not seen questions come out yet. We're running a couple minutes to go, I believe. So are there any questions that I'm not seeing do we have any questions?
I am gonna, here comes Kristen, there she is.
Hi. We do. So do you want me to ask them, Bill? Or I know we chatted them to you if not, but I can ask them if you'd like.
I don't see them on the chat thing. I may be missing them here. Go ahead and ask the questions.
All right, so here is one. Have you seen many or any mental health cases related to COVID?
If I could start with that, one of the problems about data and data collection is that you don't necessarily get into the exact details of every claim. And so it might be coded as a COVID claim, and you don't know whether or not, particularly at this stage, whether it was a psychiatric COVID claim where they thought they had it and were basically off, or they really had something and were in the hospital per se. So it's very difficult for the researchers to ask a specific claim like that and hope that they might have seen or heard something. Alex, you're muted.
You're muted.
How about now? Sorry.
Yeah.
One of the things our app does include are injury descriptions, and while I can't pull from memory the proportion of COVID claims that have a mental health component, there are some. That said, in this early stage, we are really dependent again on the great data that we have been working with from our Division of Workers' Compensation. As our personal data begins to develop with diagnosis and treatment, we will have a much better sense of comorbidities and secondary or tertiary diagnoses that give us a much richer description of the injury, much more so than nature of injury and body part.
And I might just jump in and add that so we of course have a data element that indicates whether or not a claim is a COVID claim, but then we have other diagnoses to Alex's point, so we can have multiple diagnoses. However, you might also just have a claim that has say a mental stress component to it. May not actually get a COVID indicator attached to it. In fact, one might surmise that even if I'm not getting COVID, there's enough stress in my life from COVID that it's sort of a COVID claim. So let's leave it at that.
I think that's
Well
a great
said, John.
Yeah, great point, John. And I would also just note that the states have a lot of different rules on how they approach mental claims and mental pieces to the claims. So I think we'd see a ton of variation in that.
That's a good point. Even California has a 50% threshold before it really usually can be considered a psychiatric claim. Is there another question?
Not at this time, no. We don't have any other questions. So that was a great presentation. So many different things to see what's going on in our industry and across the nation. So it's been really good. A lot of people have been asking for the handouts though, so we have been making sure that they've gotten that. But if you need the handouts, they are in your go-to control panel under handouts. They are downloadable there. So please make sure to get them, because that's what a lot of the questions or asks have been for. So they want to look at the data. Their contact information is on screen now, and it is in the handouts as well. So if you do have any questions for the panelists, they are able to be reached there. And we would like to thank you so much all for being a part of Comp Laude 2020 virtual. We couldn't have done it without you. Thank you, Jennifer, for getting everything together. So we couldn't have done everything without you. So thank you so much for being a part of it today.
Yeah, and real quick, I wanted to ask, I think that some of these were mentioned in the PowerPoint, but the resources you guys mentioned, so the app, Alex, is on your website, you said?
Yes, it's a public domain app. Just go to our website. You don't have to be a member. Just go to the research tab, and it'll be the second option right off the website.
Okay. And any other resources, if you have any questions, they should be in the presentation, or feel free to reach out. The emails are here for our panelists. And like Kristen said, we really appreciate all of you today. Thank you so much.
And a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Without the
John, Jennifer, Bill, always a pleasure.
Nice to see you all. Take care.
Delighted to be here. Thanks very much for including me.
Of course. Thank you.